So if you've been following along with us, we have seen the reinvention of slavery through the cotton gin. Once cotton became a feasible crop to grow virtually anywhere in the Deep South, what it meant was it expanded the need for slavery. And as we know, slavery was just about dead as far as people like Washington and Thomas Jefferson were concerned upon the dawning of the 19th century. This is going to breathe new life back into slavery. Now, this is also coinciding, well, maybe not, maybe that's a little bit too liberal of a term, but what we're seeing happening in the middle part of the 19th century is a push for American expansion, a geographic push. Now, what this has to do with slavery is we can see the trend here. We can see that when slavery established itself in the Chesapeake colonies, for the next 100 years, it was the lifeblood of the economy. It really made the economy go with the tobacco revolution, but ultimately it became so expensive to police, and it was delivering marginal returns by the time that the 19th century dawned, that it really didn't make any more financial sense. And if you think about it, the same thing happened to New York, slavery in New York, that is, 50, 100 years earlier. So you can see a trend that's forming. When slavery is allowed to exist in a place, eventually it'll flame out. It'll die out because it'll become more expensive to have and to police than it will to profit from. So anyway, if slavery is going to continue as a economic interest, as a special political interest, it's going to have to expand. Enter into our conversation the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now we know that when Missouri came into the country, we compromised Missouri's entrance into the nation, saying that to offset the balance of power in Congress, Maine was going to come in as a free state, Missouri was a slave state, and that would keep the balance in, especially in the Senate, perfectly even. Two more pro-slavery senators canceled out by two more anti-slavery senators from Maine. Things were okay for the time being, but the problem was in the 1840s you begin to see this push to the west. Now some historians call this Oregon fever. I call it manifest destiny, okay? Historians like myself believe that around about this time period you see more and more Americans believing in the idea of manifest destiny. It was our God-given destiny to have this continental empire, an empire from sea to shining sea. Now, what that's also going to mean is we're going to conquer that empire because, as you should well know, that's Native American land, that's Mexican land. In some instances, the British think that they own that land. And so therefore, this is going to come with conflict too. But there's going to be a lot of people, including people that we've talked about, like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, that are going to charge the American government with being involved in the slave power conspiracy. In other words, part of what Manifest Destiny is about is expanding in order to expand the kingdom of slavery. Okay? Now, what we need to talk about next is the issue of Mexico. Okay? Now, in the aftermath of winning its independence, Mexico's politics, but especially its economy, was floundering. Okay, and so what it did was it offered a situation up to one Stephen F. Austin. And what the Mexican government said was, we will allow Anglo families to come to the province of Texas, Mexico's northern boundary to the United States, and basically colonize it. In other words, it's still going to be part of the Mexican Empire, but we will allow these Anglo families to come and bring their families and work on our land to kind of jumpstart our economy. Okay. Now, this continues to happen from the 1820s well into the 1830s, and it's in the 1830s that the Mexican government believes that maybe, perhaps they have made a mistake. Maybe Anglo settlement was not what they had thought it was going to be. Okay. Now, one of the reasons for this is these Anglo families are not just bringing their families, they're also bringing their slaves, which from a very technical standpoint in Mexican politics was illegal, considering slavery was illegal in Mexico. Okay. Now, the way that the Anglos are getting around this is by not calling them slaves, they're calling them indentured servants. Well, really, what they're doing is they're forcing these slaves to sign these indentured servant contracts, and then simply saying that they're bound labor, but they're not bound indefinitely, like what would be the case in chattel slavery's instances back in Georgia or North Carolina. Okay. So anyway, in 1835, Mexico pretty much says slavery's got to end. You have to emancipate your slaves, and moreover, Anglo settlement will be discontinued. It will not be allowed to continue into the future. Well, what this does is it convinces the Anglo-Texans that this big, intrusive Mexican government needs to be dealt with. And so, in March 2nd, 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. Now, this is a big deal for a lot of different reasons, the Texas Rebellion and eventually Revolution, but it's going to pull the United States proper into this conflict. And one of the reasons it's going to do that is because there was one big, powerful, important country that will officially recognize the independence of what will later be called the Republic of Texas, and that would be the United States. Essentially, what the U.S. is doing for Texas is the same thing that France had done for the United States back in 1778. It declared that it recognized the independence of the United States from Great Britain. That's what we're doing for Texas. So as you might imagine, this really doesn't make us too many friends south of the border, and Mexico and the United States are going to have this increasingly antagonistic relationship. Okay? Now, the man put in charge of crushing the Texas Rebellion was a man by the name of General Santa Anna, Antonio Santa Anna. Now, he's a very capable military leader, and he believes that he has essentially crushed the rebellion at the Battle of the Alamo in San Antonio. Now, you know, by this point in the semester, I really don't do a whole lot of military history. There's plenty of outside reading and outside documentaries that will fill you in about the Battle of the Alamo, or better yet, you could visit San Antonio. What I will say is that Santa Anna had underestimated the resolve of the Texans and their ability to continue on in the fight. And another unintended result of the Battle of the Alamo, and again, Santa Anna could not have seen this coming, was American support for the Texas Revolution. Now, keep in mind, Mexico was a Catholic nation, and it was seen as a all-intrusive, very centralized, powerful government kind of nation, almost akin to a monarchy, and it was very unpopular in the United States. You take that, you combine it with the anti-Catholic, anti-Irish sentiment that's really beginning to crystallize in places like New York and Boston, a little bit later in New Orleans, and what this does is it really mobilizes, galvanizes really, American support for the Texas Revolution. In other words, we're really beginning to root for the Texans. It's gone beyond simply recognizing their independence. It's actually, choosing a dog in the fight, so to speak. Okay. What I will say about the end of the Texas Rebellion, it was bloody, it was very violent, and ultimately at the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texans are able to defeat Santa Anna. Now, Santa Anna vows to continue this fight. In other words, they haven't crushed his armies, his ability to continue the fight. It's put him in a position where he's no longer really able to continue with that fight. So even though the Mexican government vows to continue to fight this, for all intents and purposes, we have a Texas Revolution. Now, the very first thing that Texas does upon winning its independence is it declares that it wants to become part of the United States. It votes for annexation. The man in the White House at the time is a guy by the name of Martin Van Buren that says absolutely not. In his words, this will start off a death spiral of a struggle. Texas wants to come in as a slave state. As you might imagine, bringing those slaves in there was a very critical decision made by the Texan colonists before the Revolution, and therefore it had convinced them that they had much more in common with the American South and voted for annexation with a pro-slavery constitution. Okay? So Texas annexation, the adding of the future state of Texas, is not going to happen until well into the 1840s. Now, simultaneously, there's another push to the Pacific that we're seeing emerge, this time in the Pacific Northwest. Oregon. about this time, the 1830s and early 1840s, you're seeing the U.S. Navy publish these glowing reports about Oregon country. Now, if you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest, you know that one of the things that it does, basically morning, noon, and night, is rain. And so you have these massive red oak trees, and it's a very green, very beautiful part of North America. And it's very fertile territory. It's a really, really attractive part of North America for an agrarian nation, and we were a nation of farmers, and we're also a nation that has begun to turn our eyes toward the West in terms of our future. That's really the essence of Manifest Destiny. Okay. Now, what we see happen are these eastern and predominantly northern eastern migrants that begin to set out on the Oregon Trail in the 1840s, and they blaze a trail that can still be seen in parts of the West, including places like Wyoming, on their way to Oregon. Okay? Now, on the way, some people managed to get themselves lost and ended up in what is today California. Now, once again, like Texas, California was once upon a time a part of the northern Mexican Empire. And if you ended up in California, this was a really bad thing, considering California's climate was seen as being very arid, very hot, very dry, not enough rain to support what a lot of people considered to be a populous population, a large population. So anyway, all of this changes in the late 1840s, early 1850s, when a Swiss immigrant, a guy by the name of Michael Sutter, discovers flakes of gold in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. All of a sudden, all of these prospectors, gold miners, rush into California, and they turn San Francisco from this sleepy little outpost town into a metropolis, a major trading post, a major, really kind of outpost in the West, seemingly overnight. So all of a sudden, our tune changed with respect to California, and we offered to buy California from the Mexican government. And as you might imagine, Mexico was not exactly keen on the United States at the time, and they refused, okay? So if you think about it, the only way that we're going to really be able to take California is by conquest, okay? Similarly, whereas the Americans very much covet Oregon territory, they have Oregon fever, so to speak, they want to spread out and take that over, the British think that they own it as well. You know, the western coast of what is today Canada, that would be British Columbia, that's British territory. The British have laid claim to that. And the guy that declares his eligibility for the presidency in 1844 is a guy from Tennessee by the name of James K. Polk, right? Now, Polk's motto in the election of 1844 on the Democratic ticket is 54-40 or fight. In other words, the 54th 40th parallel, which is the southern border of what is today Alaska. Now, at the time, Alaska belonged to the Imperial Russians, and we weren't so interested in taking that. I'm not really going to get into that at the moment. But what we wanted was today British Columbia all the way south to what you would consider northwest portions of the United States, Washington State and Oregon, right? And so what Polk is saying is, if you elect me, I will take that territory, and I don't care what the British have to say about it. If they have something to say about it, we'll fight them. And it makes for great politics. I mean, if you talk about expansion in 1844, that would be the equivalent in the 21st century of saying, elect me and I will create jobs. Elect me and I will give us a vibrant working economy that works for not only the very wealthy, but for the little guys too. Adding more territory to an agrarian nation, a nation of farmers, was a really populist message, and so therefore it puts Polk in the driver's seat when it comes to winning the election. Now, for their part, the Whigs nominated our good friend Henry Clay, who was not a fan of expansion for reasons that I've already discussed. He, like Martin Van Buren, understood that this is basically going to produce civil war because both the North and the South have a vested interest in seeing more slave states or more free states added to the territory, to the country. So, expansion is one of those things that you can't talk about because it causes so many problems, but you can't not talk about it because so many people look upon this as a pro-middle class platform, okay? The long and short of this is James Polk is going to win this election by a very narrow margin, and his first order of business is to annex the state of Texas. So the first thing that Polk does when he's inaugurated, or after he's inaugurated in 1845, is he makes it official Texas comes into the Union as an additional slave state. But the addition of Texas more or less just whetted Polk's appetite when it comes to adding more territory to the United States. In particular, there is a chunk of what is modern-day Texas that was essentially disputed territory. The area between the Nueces River in the north and the Rio Grande to the south was claimed by both Mexico and the United States. So there is this dispute as to where Mexico starts and where Texas begins, and both sides have a very different understanding of where that is. Now, that's essentially what's going to start the Mexican-American War in the mid-1840s, and it's also going to occasion the addition of a massive chunk of what was Mexican territory, but what will ultimately become the southwestern part of the United States. And so what begins as expansion through manifest destiny, the idea that God wants us to have all of this territory because American culture, American politics are so superior to anywhere else in the world, ultimately ends with our assembling of a continental empire. And we'll talk about that when we pick this back up with the Mexican-American War.